Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here. Tell me, has the quiet of the evening settled where you are? Perhaps a lamp glows softly beside you, while rain touches the window and the day's noise gently fades. Dr. Watson often found that such peaceful hours sharpen the mind for careful observation. If you enjoy these calm reflections, do consider subscribing to Watson's Margins. Now, settle comfortably, for as Holmes often proved when one eliminates the impossible, whatever remains must be the truth. And if you prefer to listen on the go, you'll also find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, linked in the video description below. Chapter 1. The Quiet House on Russell Square. It is a curious feature of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular cases often arrived in the most unremarkable fashion. There were no dramatic telegrams, no breathless messenger boys collapsing upon the threshold, no pistol shots echoing from the street below. The affair I am about to set before the reader began, as so many did, with a simple knock at the door of our Baker Street rooms and the quiet, measured tread of a man who had made up his mind to ask for help, only after exhausting every other resource he possessed. It was an afternoon in late October, and London wore the season with its customary grey indifference. A thin mist had settled over the city since morning, softening the edges of chimney-pots and lamp-posts alike into something faintly impressionistic. I'd returned from my rounds earlier than expected and found Holmes in his customary position before the cold fireplace, a long clay pipe in his hand, his grey eyes fixed upon some middle distance that existed, I suspect, nowhere but within his own formidable mind. Papers were spread across the basket chair, and a violin lay neglected upon the sofa. He had been restless for the better part of a fortnight, and I had grown accustomed to the slight tension about his jaw that told me no case of sufficient interest had presented itself. "You are early, Watson," he said without turning. "My last patient cancelled," I replied, settling into my chair and reaching for the evening paper. "I confess I am glad of the rest." Holmes made no reply, and we sat in comfortable silence for some minutes. The only sounds the distant rumble of traffic and the occasional cry of a vendor in the street below. It was precisely the sort of quiet October afternoon that seems made for contemplation rather than action, and I was beginning to entertain thoughts of an early supper when Mrs. Hudson's footstep sounded upon the stair, and with it a heavier, deliberate tread that I did not recognise. "A Mr. Percival Ashcombe to see you, Mr. Holmes," said our landlady, with that particular neutrality of expression she reserved for visitors whose circumstances she had already begun to assess. "He says it is a professional matter." Holmes's posture changed almost imperceptibly. The vague lassitude vanished from his frame. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson." The man who entered was perhaps 60 years of age, and possessed of an upright bearing that suggested military experience, though he wore the discreet dark dress of the legal profession. His side whiskers were iron grey, his hands steady, and his boots immaculately polished. Yet for all this outward composure, there was about his eyes the unmistakable shadow of a man who has slept poorly for several nights together, and who has arrived at our door only after a private struggle that cost him something. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "my name is Ashcombe. Percival Ashcombe, of Ashcombe and Rennie, solicitors of Gray's Inn. I must apologise for presenting myself without an appointment, but I find myself in a position that admits of very little delay." "Pray sit down, Mr. Ashcombe," said Holmes pleasantly. "You will permit me to observe that the matter is both urgent and disagreeable to you personally, and that you have spent the last 3 days attempting to persuade yourself it could be resolved without outside assistance. My friend Dr. Watson is entirely in my confidence. You may speak freely." Ashcombe blinked at this, and then, with the quiet fortitude of a man long accustomed to accepting unpleasant truths, lowered himself into the basket chair and folded his hands upon his knee. "You are correct on every point," he said simply. "I shall come directly to the matter. He represented," he explained, "the estate of the late Sir Lionel Braithwaite. The name was not unfamiliar to me. Sir Lionel had been a figure of considerable distinction in philanthropic circles, a man whose contributions to various charitable institutions had earned him widespread respect. and whose reputation for personal integrity was regarded as quite without blemish. He had died some 10 days previously at his residence in Russell Square. "A sudden death?" Holmes inquired. "His physician diagnosed heart failure," Ashcombe replied carefully. "Sir Lionel was 71 and had not been in robust health. The death was not, on the face of it, unexpected." Holmes nodded, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. "And yet it has produced a complication. A very serious one." Ashcombe drew a slow breath. "In the days immediately preceding his death, Sir Lionel intimated to me in the course of a private consultation that he had prepared a legal declaration of some personal importance. He did not disclose its precise contents, but he was emphatic that it was to be preserved securely and that it would require my attention following his death. He told me he had locked it in his study desk, to which only he held the key." "And the declaration has since vanished," said Holmes quietly. Ashcombe looked up sharply. "You knew?" "I inferred. Pray continue." The solicitor composed himself. "When I attended the house after Sir Lionel's death to attend to the preliminary affairs of the estate, the desk was opened in the presence of the household. The declaration was not there. Indeed, every person present, Miss Eleanor Braithwaite, Sir Lionel's niece and principal heir, the family physician Dr. Arthur Fenwick, the secretary Mr. Julian Mercer, and an old friend of the deceased, Colonel Harrington, each one stated categorically that they had no knowledge of any such document, and that to their understanding it did not exist." "Ah," said Holmes. "All 4 of them?" "All 4, Ashcombe confirmed. "That is most interesting," said Holmes, and the ghost of something that might have been satisfaction crossed his lean features. "One person denying a thing carries weight. 4 people denying it in perfect agreement carries rather less. Tell me about the household itself." Ashcombe painted the picture with a solicitor's careful brush. The house in Russell Square was a substantial property, maintained in a manner befitting Sir Lionel's station. It was by every account a house of order and dignity, quiet in its habits, discreet in its hospitality, and governed with the unobtrusive efficiency that speaks of long-established domestic arrangements. Miss Eleanor Braithwaite had lived there since the death of her father, Sir Lionel's younger brother, some 8 years previously. She was, Ashcombe described her, a composed and capable woman of 35, universally regarded as devoted to her uncle. Dr. Fenwick had served as Sir Lionel's physician for nearly a decade, a steady, respectable practitioner of middle age. Mr. Julian Mercer had occupied the position of private secretary for the past 3 years, managing Sir Lionel's considerable correspondence and charitable administration. Colonel Harrington, a retired officer of the Indian Army, had been among Sir Lionel's oldest friends, and had been visiting the house for a fortnight at the time of the death. "And all," said Holmes, "were cooperative. All expressed appropriate concern. All offered perfectly consistent accounts." "They did," said Ashcombe. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, that it was this very consistency that first disturbed me. In my experience, when 4 people in a household tell precisely the same story, it is not because they all remember the same truth. It is generally because they have agreed upon the same version." Holmes rose abruptly from his chair and crossed to the window, gazing down into the mist-wrapped street below. He was silent for a long moment. Then he turned, and there was something bright and purposeful in his eyes that I had not seen there for many days. "Watson," he said, "I believe we shall call upon the Braithwaite household tomorrow morning. Will you accompany me?" I told him there was nothing I should like better. Holmes addressed Ashcombe with brisk precision. "You will furnish me with a letter of introduction, Mr. Ashcombe, and you will say nothing further to the household about this consultation. I am particularly anxious that they should continue to believe the matter of the declaration is regarded as closed." He paused. "One more question. Among these 4 persons, the niece, the physician, the secretary and the colonel, did any one of them appear, to your observation, to be rather more eager than the others to confirm that the declaration had never existed?" Ashcombe considered the question with care. "Now that you raise it," he said slowly, "I believe they all were. and that I now think is the strangest thing of all. After the solicitor had departed, I found Holmes standing once again at the window, his pipe now lit, the blue smoke curling lazily about his head. "What do you make of it?" I asked. "I make very little of it yet," he replied without turning. "But I find it suggestive, Watson, that a man of established reputation and careful habits should prepare a legal declaration of importance, lock it in his desk, communicate its existence to his solicitor, and then die, leaving behind 4 people who have never heard of it. It suggests to me not a theft, but something rather more deliberate, something rather more patient." He turned, and there was the cold precision of a scientific instrument in his gaze. "We shall call it for the present a concealment," which is, of course, an altogether more interesting thing. I agreed that it was. And, as the October mist deepened over Baker Street and the lamplighter made his quiet rounds below our window, I found myself looking forward, not for the first time, to accompanying my extraordinary friend into whatever peculiar darkness this new case might hold. Chapter 2. A document that never existed. Russell Square presented itself the following morning, under a sky of polished pewter, the plane trees stripped almost bare by the season, their remaining leaves collecting damply against the iron railings. The square itself retained a certain faded grandeur. The houses tall and well-proportioned, the pavements swept, the brass fittings of the neighbouring doors maintained with the quiet pride of people who consider appearances a form of honesty. Number 34, the Braithwaite residence, was the most handsome of them all. 4 stories of dark London brick, its windows dressed with half-mourning, a black crape bow affixed to the door-knocker in deference to its recently departed master. Holmes paused on the pavement for a moment before we ascended the steps. I had learned not to interpret these small hesitations as indecision. He was, I knew, simply reading the house, noting the precise position of the blinds, the condition of the front steps, the number of footprints in the thin film of morning dampness that lay upon the stone. Then he mounted the steps with his customary ease and rang the bell. We were admitted by a manservant of advanced years whose expression conveyed the particular grief of long service. Less theatrical than a relation's sorrow, but more deeply worn. Young Holmes presented Ashcombe's letter of introduction, and within a few minutes we were shown into a drawing-room of considerable comfort, if somewhat austere taste. The furnishings were of good quality and some age. The pictures on the walls were portraits rather than landscapes, and the general impression was of a house governed more by habit than by fashion. Miss Eleanor Braithwaite received us with a composure that I thought immediately genuine. She was tall, dark-haired, and pale in the manner of a woman who has wept in private but will not do so in company. Her black dress was sombre without being theatrical, and she greeted us with a directness of gaze that spoke of intelligence and, I suspected, considerable reserves of self-possession. "Mr. Holmes," she said, "Mr. Now Ashcombe has written to explain that you have been consulted regarding the question of my uncle's affairs. I confess I am uncertain what further light can be shed on the matter, but I am willing to assist in any way I can." "You are very good, Miss Braithwaite," said Holmes pleasantly. "I have only a few questions at present, and I hope to trouble the household as briefly as possible. If I may, I should like first to be shown the study." Something passed across her face. Not reluctance, precisely, but a certain quiet attentiveness. "Of course," she said. "It has been left undisturbed." The study occupied the rear of the first floor, a well-proportioned room facing the small garden. It was lined on 2 sides with bookshelves, the volumes arranged with the systematic care of a man who uses his library rather than merely possesses it. A large writing desk of mahogany stood before the window, its surface cleared of papers but otherwise unaltered. On the mantelpiece a small carriage clock ticked with patient indifference. The room smelled of leather, old paper, and, faintly, of ash. Holmes moved through the room without haste, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes passing over each surface with the swift, comprehensive thoroughness of a man reading a page of print. He paused at the fireplace, crouched briefly to examine the grate, then rose and crossed to the desk, circling it once before drawing back the chair and studying the surface with great attention. Ashcombe, who had arrived shortly after us and now stood near the doorway, addressed the room at large. As I explained to the household previously, Sir Lionel informed me that the declaration was locked in the upper left drawer of this desk. The key was found on his person after death. And the drawer was locked when the key was applied to it, Holmes asked, without looking up from the desk. It was. And the declaration was absent. Entirely so. Holmes opened the drawer and studied its interior for some moments. Then he closed it with care and turned to Miss Braithwaite, who had remained near the doorway with a stillness I found admirable. "Your uncle drafted a great deal of correspondence from this desk?" he asked. "A very great deal," she replied. "His charitable work alone generated hundreds of letters each year. Mr. Mercer managed the greater part of it, but my uncle insisted on writing certain letters himself. And Mercer would have worked in this room? He had his own small office adjoining, but yes, he used this room frequently when my uncle required him. At that moment the door opened and two men entered together, or rather, one of them held the door for the other with a deference that told its own quiet story. The first was a compact, neat figure of perhaps 45, with close-cropped fair hair and a manner of watchful efficiency that reminded me of certain staff officers I had encountered during my time in Afghanistan. This, I gathered, was Julian Mercer. Behind him came Dr. Arthur Fenwick, a broader man, somewhat florid in complexion, whose professional ease of manner was slightly undermined by the way his eyes moved quickly to the desk before settling, with apparent deliberate effort, upon Holmes. Introductions were made. Mercer spoke first, his voice smooth and well modulated. "I understand you are looking into the question of the declaration, Mr. Holmes. I can only reiterate what I have already told Mr. Ashcombe. I was in Sir Lionel's employ for 3 years, and I never heard him speak of any such document." "Quite so," said Holmes amiably. "Tell me, Mr. Mercer, in the ordinary course of your duties, did you have occasion to use the inkstand on this desk?" Mercer blinked at the question. "Occasionally, yes, when working directly with Sir Lionel on correspondence." "And you are yourself from Yorkshire, I believe?" "I am, yes. From Harrogate originally." Holmes nodded, apparently satisfied, and turned to Fenwick. "Dr. Fenwick, you attended Sir Lionel in his final illness." "I trust the death certificate presents no ambiguity." "None whatsoever," said Fenwick, with the firmness of a man repeating something he has had occasion to say more than once. "Sir Lionel's heart had been weakened for some years. The collapse, when it came, was consistent with everything I had anticipated. He was engaged in correspondence that evening, I understand." "He was. It was not unusual. He often wrote in the evenings." Holmes had, during this exchange, allowed his attention to drift with apparent casualness toward the fireplace. He glanced into the grate once more, then remarked, as though the thought had only just occurred to him, "A good deal was burned here recently." "Sir Lionel occasionally burned drafts," Miss Braithwaite said. "He was particular about waste paper." "No doubt," said Holmes. Colonel Harrington joined us a few minutes later, a broad-shouldered man of perhaps 65, with the sun-darkened complexion of one long accustomed to outdoor climates, and a directness of manner that I found immediately sympathetic. He shook hands with Holmes and me without formality, and settled himself into one of the study chairs with the ease of a man entirely comfortable in his surroundings. "I shall tell you plainly, Mr. Holmes," he said, before Holmes had put a single question, "that I know nothing about any declaration, and I do not believe for a moment that Lionel wrote one. He was not a secretive man. If he had intended to alter any legal arrangement, he would have discussed it openly." He paused. "He was my oldest friend." "I should have known." Holmes regarded the Colonel for a moment with what I can only describe as careful neutrality. "You were with him in the days before his death," he said. "How did he seem to you?" The Colonel's expression shifted. Something moved across it that was clearly and unmistakably grief. "Quieter than usual," he said at last. "Preoccupied. I assumed it was his health. Now I cannot say with confidence what it was." We departed Russell Square an hour later. Holmes maintaining an air of agreeable vagueness that I recognised as concealing something rather more definite. In the cab returning to Baker Street he said very little. He sat with one knee crossed over the other, watching the streets slip past with the remote attentiveness of a man cataloguing data. "Well?" I ventured as we turned into Marylebone Road. Holmes was quiet for a moment longer. Then he said, "The Colonel is genuinely puzzled, Watson. The niece is genuinely grieving. Fenwick is nervous, but the nervousness of a man protecting his professional reputation, I think, rather than his conscience." He paused. "Mercer, however, is something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "A man from Harrogate who reaches, however briefly, for a different cadence when he grows uneasy." Holmes turned from the window, and who, when asked about the inkstand, looked not at the inkstand, but at the drawer beside it. He settled back against the cushions. "The case concerns not what was stolen, Watson. It concerns what was replaced." I turned this over in my mind for the remainder of the journey, and found that it only deepened the mystery rather than illuminated it, which, need I'd long since learned, meant that Holmes was proceeding in precisely the right direction. Chapter 3. Death without violence. There are cases in which the absence of violence is itself the most disturbing feature. A crime committed with force announces itself. It leaves broken things behind, and broken things demand explanation. But a death that arrives quietly, in the ordinary course of nature, and that is accepted without question by all who witness it, such a death may conceal within itself a wrong far more calculated than any act of open brutality. It was this uncomfortable thought that occupied my mind in the days following our visit to Russell Square, and I confess it coloured my reading of the medical details Holmes set before me on the Thursday evening. He had spent the intervening days in a manner outwardly resembling idleness. He kept irregular hours, disappeared twice without explanation, and on one occasion sat for the better part of an afternoon, engaged in what appeared to be an intensive study of the London Post Office directory. I had learned not to inquire during these intervals. The results, when they came, were invariably worth the waiting. On Thursday, he returned to Baker Street at 6:30 with a slim leather document case under his arm, shook the rain from his coat, and dropped into his chair with the alert satisfaction of a man who has completed a productive day's hunting. "Sit down, Watson," he said. "I should value your professional opinion." He spread upon the table between us a collection of papers, the death certificate issued by Dr. Fenwick, the physician's own notes from his attendance upon Sir Lionel in the final weeks, and a brief summary of circumstances prepared, Holmes explained, by Ashcombe's clerk at Holmes's request. I drew my chair closer and applied myself to the documents, while Holmes lit his pipe and watched me with the patient attention of a teacher awaiting a pupil's response. The medical facts taken alone presented nothing overtly suspicious. Sir Lionel had suffered from a chronic weakness of the cardiac muscle, well documented across several years of Fenwick's case notes. There had been 2 earlier episodes of cardiac irregularity, each treated with digitalis and rest. The final collapse had occurred in the study shortly after 9 o'clock in the evening, and Fenwick, who had been a dinner guest that same night, had attended within minutes, and death had been certified as heart failure. "The death is consistent with the history," I said, setting down the notes. "Fenwick's documentation is thorough. The prior episodes establish the predisposition clearly enough." "Quite so," said Holmes. "Now, set aside what the documents tell you, and tell me instead what they do not." I looked at him. "That is a physician's question, Holmes, not a detective's. Humour me." I returned to the papers with fresh attention. Presently I said, "There is no post-mortem record. There is not. With a history of cardiac disease and a physician present at the death, none would ordinarily be required. Fenwick would have had every professional justification for certifying without one." I paused. "But it does mean that the precise circumstances of the final hour cannot be externally verified." Holmes released a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "Continue." "The final case notes," I said slowly, "are dated 3 days before death. There is no record of a consultation in the last 72 hours, though the notes from the previous month indicate fortnightly visits at minimum. I looked up. If Sir Lionel was unwell enough to die, one might have expected Fenwick to have seen him more recently. One might, Holmes agreed, though Fenwick's explanation, which I obtained from him this afternoon in a brief and not entirely comfortable conversation, is that Sir Lionel had appeared improved and had declined the last arranged visit. He cancelled it himself? According to Fenwick, yes. I sat with that for a moment. That is not impossible. Patients do cancel appointments, particularly those who dislike being told to rest. It is not impossible, Holmes conceded pleasantly. It is merely convenient. He rose and moved to the mantelpiece, turning to face me with his back to the cold grate. Now attend to this, Watson, because it is the part I find most instructive. On the evening of Sir Lionel's death, 4 people were present in the house. Miss Eleanor, Mercer, Harrington, who had retired early with a headache, and Fenwick, who was dining as a guest. The collapse occurred after dinner. Sir Lionel had returned to his study to attend to correspondence. Alone? Initially, Mercer looked in upon him at approximately 8:30, he has stated, to deliver the evening post. He left Sir Lionel apparently well and writing at his desk. An hour later, the manservant heard a sound, not a cry apparently, but something falling, and summoned Fenwick, who was still in the dining room with Miss Eleanor. I considered this carefully. The writing paper that was burned in the fireplace, was that discovered that same evening, or later? Holmes's expression sharpened appreciatively. That is precisely the question I put to the manservant, who is the only remaining witness to the study's condition in the first moments after the body was discovered. He recalls the fire in the grate burning somewhat high when he entered, higher, he said, than Sir Lionel customarily kept it, but in the distress of the moment it was not remarked upon. And by the time anyone thought to examine the grate carefully, whatever had been committed to it was ash. Holmes returned to his chair. I also put a question to Miss Braithwaite regarding the inkstand. She told me quite readily that her uncle always used the same ink, a good English commercial variety, purchased from a stationer on Southampton Row. She had replenished it herself only a fortnight before his death. Then the Belgian ink, I said, was introduced by someone else, and introduced recently, since the stationer's ink remains present in the lower well, only partially diluted by the addition. He picked up his pipe once more. A man writing letters of some urgency, Watson, in the study of another man, using ink he has brought with him, on an evening when that other man is found dead. I will admit that the room felt somewhat colder than it had a few minutes before. You're suggesting that Mercer was writing in that study on the night Sir Lionel died? I am suggesting that someone was, and that they left in something of a hurry. Burning papers, certainly, but not entirely finishing the work they had come to do. There was a silence. Outside, the rain had renewed itself against the Baker Street windows, and the sound of a passing cab was briefly audible before the quiet reasserted itself. "Holmes," I said, "if Sir Lionel died naturally, as Fenwick certifies, if the cardiac history is genuine and the death is exactly what it appears, then what we are looking at is not a murderer, but an opportunist." Holmes looked at me with undisguised satisfaction. "Now you have it, Watson. Precisely so. A man who had reason to fear what Sir Lionel intended to make known, who did not cause the death but who seized upon it with remarkable speed, who used the confusion of those first terrible minutes to do quietly and efficiently what he had been planning for some time." He paused. "That is, I think, a colder thing than murder. It requires patience, it requires calculation, and it requires a thorough knowledge of the household, the habits of its master, and the contents of his desk." I thought of Julian Mercer's smooth, watchful composure, the careful accent, the too prompt denial. "You mentioned a red herring," I said. "Ashcombe told us there were rumours of a violent quarrel between Sir Lionel and Colonel Harrington." Holmes waved the matter aside, though not dismissively. "I have spoken with Harrington at some length. The quarrel existed. It was disagreement about the management of a charitable fund in which both men had an interest. Sharp words were exchanged. Harrington is an honest man and does not attempt to minimise it. But it was the quarrel of two old friends over a point of principle, not of money, and Harrington's distress at Sir Lionel's death has every quality of the genuine article. He fixed me with a level look. That quarrel has been made much of in the household's conversation since the death. It provides a ready-made narrative of discord, a reason to look toward family and friends for the source of any trouble. It suits someone admirably. It draws the eye away from the study, and from the inkstand, and from the ash in the grate, and from a secretary who speaks with a faint music that does not belong to the West Riding of Yorkshire. He rose and moved to the window, looking out into the rain-blurred street. "Tomorrow, Watson, I intend to make some inquiries of a rather more specialised nature. There is a thread here that runs back further than Russell Square, I think. Further than London, perhaps. I mean to find where it begins." He said nothing more that evening, and I did not press him. But I slept uneasily, occupied by the image of a man writing by firelight in a dead man's study, and the quiet efficiency with which he had tried to make certain things disappear. Chapter 4. The Secretary's Hand. The science of handwriting has never enjoyed the unqualified respect of the legal profession, and I have heard more than one barrister dismiss graphological evidence with a contempt that is, on reflection, not entirely unwarranted. Handwriting analysis invites subjectivity, and subjectivity is the enemy of the courtroom. Holmes, however, approached the subject from an altogether different angle. He was not interested in character or temperament as expressed through penmanship. The wilder claims of the graphologist held no appeal for a mind as rigorously empirical as his. What interested him was something far more concrete, the mechanical habits of a particular hand, acquired over years of practice, as individual and as indelible as a set of fingerprints. He had said nothing further about his intended inquiries when Friday arrived, and I found him at the breakfast table surrounded by an assortment of documents that had not been there the previous evening. Several were handwritten letters on stationery I recognised as the Braithwaite household's, forwarded by Ashcombe. Others were official-looking papers in a hand I did not recognise. Holmes was comparing them with the methodical attention of a scholar engaged in textual collation, a magnifying glass in his right hand and a cold cup of tea at his left elbow. I poured myself a fresh cup and sat opposite him. He did not look up. "The letters at your end of the table," he said, "are from Sir Lionel's correspondence file, covering the last 4 months of his life. Those nearest me are from the year before Mercer entered his employment." I examined the letters at my end. The handwriting was regular, upright, and firmly executed. The hand of a man accustomed to writing clearly and at length. There was a slight leftward pressure on the downstrokes that gave each letter a distinctive solidity. "These are Sir Lionel's?" I asked. "Unquestionably. Now look at these." He slid 3 letters across the table, also attributed to Sir Lionel, written according to their dates within the last 8 months. I studied them carefully. The letters were similar, superficially very similar. The general proportions were faithfully reproduced, the spacing between words was consistent, and the overall impression at a glance was of the same hand. But there were differences, and the longer I looked, the more apparent they became. The leftward pressure on the downstrokes was absent. The capital letters, particularly the B and the L, Ravaz had a slight forward lean that was not present in the earlier examples, and there was a fluency to certain letter combinations, the TH, the IN, the ER, that suggested a handwriting naturally rather than imitating. "Someone has been writing in Sir Lionel's name," I said, "practising more precisely and with considerable skill." Holmes set down his glass. "The imitation is good enough to satisfy a casual reader, good enough certainly for routine correspondence and administrative letters, but it is not Sir Lionel's hand. It is the hand of someone who studied Sir Lionel's writing with care and reproduced it systematically, but could not entirely suppress the habits of his own formation." He tapped one of the letters. "You see that the imitator writes his small e with a closed loop. So, Sir Lionel's e is invariably open at the top. A trivial detail, entirely invisible unless you're looking for it, but absolutely consistent across every letter in this second group. How long has this been going on? The earliest example I can identify with certainty is 6 months ago, which means that Mercer, I use the name advisedly, began substituting his own hand for Sir Lionel's letters almost a year into his employment. Sufficient time, I would think, to have made a thorough study of the original. I set down the letters and reached for my tea, which had by now grown similarly cold. To what end? If Sir Lionel was alive and directing his own affairs, why would Mercer need to write his correspondence for him? He would not need to write all of it, only those letters which Sir Lionel had not in fact written. Letters that perhaps were never shown to Sir Lionel at all. Holmes leaned back, pressing his fingertips together in the manner I knew well. Consider, Watson, the nature of Sir Lionel's philanthropic work. Large sums passing between institutions, correspondence with banks, with trustees, with foreign charitable organisations, a great deal of it necessarily delegated to a trusted secretary, with Sir Lionel merely signing where required, or, he paused, appearing to sign. The implication settled over the room like a change in atmospheric pressure. He was forging Sir Lionel's signature on financial documents, I said. I believe so, yes, and I believe Sir Lionel eventually discovered it. We sat with that conclusion for a moment. A coal shifted in the grate. From the street below came the cry of a newspaper vendor, remote and cheerful, entirely indifferent to the quiet gravity of our sitting room. The declaration, I said, Sir Lionel's declaration that he prepared before his death. It was not about the inheritance at all. I am increasingly confident it was not. It was a confession of what he had discovered, a record of Mercer's fraud. Holmes rose from the table, which explains why its disappearance suited Mercer so perfectly, and why it was essential that the household should confirm unanimously that no such document had ever existed. If no declaration was ever prepared, no discovery was ever made. If no discovery was ever made, there is no fraud to investigate. He moved to the window. Sir Lionel was 71 years old, Watson, and in uncertain health. He had discovered at the end of his life that a man he had trusted implicitly had been exploiting that trust to defraud charitable institutions, perhaps for years. He did what a man of honour would do. He set it down in writing, sealed it, informed his solicitor, and intended to deliver it to the proper authorities. And then he died. At which point Mercer acted, burning what he could, replacing what he could not destroy, and constructing in its place a document that redirected all attention toward family discord and questions of inheritance. Holmes turned from the window. There is one further matter I discovered yesterday that I have not yet mentioned. Mercer's clothing. His tailoring, I said, recalling Holmes's remark during our visit. You noted it was too fine for a secretary's salary. I did. A modest clerk in charitable administration does not commission his suits from a tailor in Jermyn Street. I took the liberty of making an enquiry there yesterday afternoon. The account is in the name of a Mr. Jules Mercier, not Mercer, you observe, and has been active for nearly 4 years. He allowed the significance of this to stand without embellishment. A different name, I said slowly. A different name and, I suspect, a different history. Though establishing that history with the precision this case requires will demand a somewhat longer reach than Jermyn Street. He crossed to the desk and drew out a sheet of paper. I have this morning written to a colleague in Brussels, an official of my acquaintance whose discretion I can rely upon. With reasonable fortune, we shall have a reply within the week. I found myself studying the forged letters again, struck by the patience they represented. Months of quiet practice, the gradual perfection of a disguise constructed not in appearance but in ink. It is a peculiarly cold-blooded form of deception, I said, to spend a year learning to write like another man. Cold-blooded, yes, Holmes agreed, but also, in its way, revealing. A man who takes such pains is not acting from impulse or desperation. He is protecting something, a position, an income, a constructed identity. He has a great deal to lose, Watson. which makes him more dangerous than a man who acts in passion, but also," he smiled thinly, "rather more predictable." That afternoon, a new development arrived. Not from Brussels, but from within the household itself. A message was delivered to Baker Street by hand, unsigned, written on plain paper in a deliberately disguised script. It contained 3 sentences only, and Holmes read them twice before passing the note to me without comment. It read, "Miss Braithwaite did not mourn her uncle. She knew what the declaration contained. She wished it destroyed as much as anyone." I looked up from the note. Holmes's expression was one of mild, almost academic interest. "Well?" I said. "Well indeed, Watson." He took the note back and examined the paper briefly before setting it aside. "Someone in that house is growing anxious, and an anxious man, in my experience, invariably makes his first mistake." Chapter 5. Genuine Grief and Practised Concern. Holmes did not speak of the anonymous note again that evening, but I noticed that he kept it. He folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat rather than among the case papers on the table, which suggested to me that he attached to it a significance he was not yet prepared to articulate. I had known him long enough to understand that his silences were not evasions but incubations, and I left him to his thoughts without comment. The following morning brought a change in weather, and, with it, a change in Holmes's manner. The introspective quietude of the previous days had lifted entirely. He was dressed and at the door before I had finished my breakfast, brisk and purposeful, in the way that invariably meant action was imminent. "I intend to return to Russell Square this morning," he said, drawing on his gloves. "Not to examine the study again, but to speak with each member of the household individually. Will you come?" I told him I would, and within the quarter hour we were in a cab heading east through a morning of thin, cold sunshine that gave the streets a clean, provisional brightness, as though London had been briefly rinsed and set out to dry. Ashcombe had arranged our access with characteristic efficiency. We were shown, on arrival, into the morning room rather than the drawing room, a smaller, less formal space that looked onto the side garden and carried a more intimate atmosphere. Holmes had, I gathered, specifically requested it. A setting without ceremony, he had once observed to me, tends to produce conversation without performance. Miss Eleanor Braithwaite came to us first. She wore the same unadorned morning dress as before, and there was about her this morning a quality I could only describe as steadiness. Not the hard steadiness of a person suppressing emotion, but the quieter steadiness of one who has passed through the worst of grief and arrived at a kind of exhausted clarity on the other side. She sat without fidgeting, her hands folded in her lap, and met Holmes's gaze directly. "I appreciate your patience with this process, Miss Braithwaite," Holmes said, settling into the chair opposite her with easy courtesy. "I have only a few questions, and they concern matters peripheral to your own affairs. You may ask whatever you wish, Mr. Holmes. You were close to your uncle." It was not phrased as a question, but she answered it as one. "Very close. He was the most important person in my life for 8 years. Whatever else may be said of these circumstances, I want you to understand that his death is not, to me, a matter of estates and declarations. It is simply a loss from which I do not expect to recover quickly." Holmes nodded. "The anonymous communication that reached me yesterday evening suggested that you had prior knowledge of the declaration's contents and desired its destruction. I tell you this plainly, because I think plainness is what you deserve, and because I place no weight whatever on the suggestion." She received this without any visible shock, which told its own story. She had either expected it, or had already guessed its origin. "I knew nothing of any declaration," she said quietly. "My uncle did not discuss his legal arrangements with me. He was of the generation that considers such things unsuitable conversation for a woman, however capable she might otherwise be. There was no bitterness in this, only a sort of fond, resigned accuracy. He was a man of his time. I loved him for what he was, not what he might have been." Holmes asked a few further questions, about her uncle's habits in the final weeks, about Mercer's behaviour, about any unusual correspondence she might have observed, and her answers were consistent, unembellished and entirely persuasive. When she left us, I said nothing, but Holmes caught my expression. "Quite so," he said simply. Colonel Harrington was next. He arrived carrying his hat and did not sit immediately, but stood for a moment near the window in the manner of a man more comfortable on his feet. He was, I thought, a person to whom rooms had always felt slightly too small. "I have already told you everything I know, Mr. Holmes," he said, not ungraciously. "I am not sure what further use I can be." "You may be a great deal of use," said Holmes. "Tell me about Sir Lionel's state of mind in the weeks before his death. Not his health, his mind." Harrington was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "He was troubled," he said at last. "I noticed it from the first day of my visit. He was preoccupied is the word I used before, but it is not quite right. He was troubled. There is a difference. Preoccupation is intellectual. What Lionel carried was something heavier, a moral weight." "Did you ask him about it?" "I tried. He deflected. Said it was business he was attending to, that it would shortly be resolved." A pause. "That was the Wednesday. He died the following Monday. And the quarrel, the matter of the charitable fund." Harrington's jaw tightened slightly, not in defensiveness, but in the manner of a man revisiting a regret. He believed I had approved expenditures from the Meridian Fund without proper authorization. I had not, or rather, I had authorized them in good faith on the basis of paperwork that, I now realize, I should have examined more carefully. We argued about it, sharply, and then 2 days later he was dead, and I never had the chance to settle it between us properly. He looked up. "That, Mr. Holmes, is what I carry. Not guilt of the kind your anonymous correspondent may wish to imply, but the ordinary, wretched guilt of a man who quarrelled with his oldest friend and did not make it right before the end." Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then, "The paperwork you approved, Colonel, was it prepared by Mercer?" Something shifted in Harrington's expression. He had clearly not made this connection himself, or not fully. "It came through him, yes, as all administrative documents did." "Thank you," said Holmes. "That is precisely what I needed." Harrington left with more animation in his step than he had entered with, though I suspected he was not yet entirely certain why. Dr. Fenwick was a different proposition. He came into the room with professional composure fully assembled, like a man who has dressed not merely his body but his manner before leaving the house. He was cordial, clear, and cooperative in a way that was somehow exhausting. Each answer arrived slightly too promptly, slightly too complete, as though he had already considered the likely questions and prepared his responses in advance. Holmes asked him about Sir Lionel's final days with the patient, methodical courtesy he always employed when he wished a subject to feel at ease. Fenwick spoke freely about the cardiac history, the management of symptoms, the patient's general resilience. He was entirely convincing on these medical matters, and well he should have been. There was nothing false in the clinical record itself, I felt certain. It was only when Holmes steered the conversation toward the household's daily arrangements that a subtle alteration occurred, not in what Fenwick said, but in the pace of it. The slight pause before each reply lengthened by perhaps half a second. Trivial in isolation, but consistent, like the barely perceptible hesitation of a man translating from one language to another in his head before speaking. "You were aware of Mr. Mercer's movements on the evening of Sir Lionel's death?" Holmes asked. "Only generally. He was in the house, as we all were." "You did not see him in the study at any point during the evening?" "I did not." A pause of precisely the kind I had noted. "I was with Miss Braithwaite in the dining room for the greater part of the evening." "Of course." Holmes smiled pleasantly and moved to another subject entirely, and Fenwick's pace normalized again almost at once. When the physician had gone, I turned to Holmes and said, "He is hiding something." "He is," Holmes agreed, "though I don't yet think it is the central thing. Fenwick is a man protecting a professional failure rather than a personal crime. He saw something, or failed to see something, on the night of Sir Lionel's death, something he regards as a dereliction of his duty, even if it is not in law any kind of offence. Holmes rose and moved to the door. He will tell us in time. Men of Fenwick's type eventually require the relief of confession. The weight becomes greater than the risk. We took our leave of Russell Square shortly before noon. On the pavement outside, Holmes paused and looked back at the handsome dark brick facade with an expression of quiet deliberation. "Holmes," I said, "true emotion rarely arrives at the correct moment. You said something to that effect earlier in this business?" "I did." "Mercer's expression seemed rehearsed, you told me, as though the feelings arrived on cue." "Precisely so." I buttoned my coat against the autumn chill. "Then it strikes me that in this house we have now spoken to three people whose emotions were entirely uncalculated, and one whose were entirely otherwise. That disproportion alone tells a story." Holmes glanced at me with what I recognised after many years as genuine appreciation. "Watson," he said, "you continue to exceed my expectations at the most gratifying moments." And he set off along the pavement at his characteristic pace, leaving me to follow as ever, in the wake of a mind that never, even for a moment, stood entirely still. Chapter 6. The ink that betrays the writer. It has been my observation, over the many years I spent at Holmes's side, that the most decisive moments in his investigations rarely announce themselves as such. There were no dramatic flourishes, no sudden cries of revelation. What there was, more often, was a quiet afternoon, and a small experiment conducted with the unhurried precision of a man who already suspects what he will find, and is simply establishing the courtesy of proof. So it was on the Saturday following our second visit to Russell Square, when Holmes returned to the Braithwaite study for what he described to Ashcombe, with complete accuracy, as a purely technical examination. Miss Braithwaite received us without ceremony and left us to our work. The study was unchanged, the same ordered shelves, the same carriage clock marking the silence, the same cold fireplace with its residue of secrets. Holmes moved directly to the writing desk and opened the inkstand with the care of a surgeon approaching a critical incision. The inkstand was a double-welled piece of cut glass with a brass fitting, the sort of article that sits on 1,000 English desks without attracting the slightest notice. Holmes produced from his coat pocket a small leather roll of the kind a watchmaker might carry, and from it extracted a glass pipette no longer than his finger. He drew a single drop from the left well and transferred it to a strip of blotting paper he had brought with him, then repeated the operation with the right well. I watched from a respectful distance. "2 inks," I said. The left well contains the stationer's ink Miss Braithwaite described, an entirely standard composition, iron gall, London manufacture. The right well is something rather different. He held the blotting strip to the light from the window. A blue-black in the English style, but with a particular quality to the sheen when dry. Continental composition. The shellac content is higher than in English inks of this type, which gives the line a slight gloss. He set the strip aside. "I have seen this particular formulation before, Watson. It is favoured by certain professional offices in Belgium, particularly those in the financial sector. The composition is distinctive enough to trace to a small number of manufacturers. Can you identify the manufacturer specifically?" "I have already done so. Yesterday morning I took samples to a chemist of my acquaintance in Holborn, who has made ink composition something of a speciality. He confirmed without hesitation that the formulation matches a product supplied exclusively by a Brussels stationery house called Vernet et Fils." Holmes folded the blotting strip and placed it carefully in an envelope. "They supply principally to banking houses and financial institutions, not, it should be noted, to private individuals." The significance of this settled quietly into place. "A man who worked in a financial house in Brussels," I said, "and who carried the professional habits of that employment with him when he reinvented himself in London." Holmes turned from the window and crouched before the desk, examining the leather surface of the blotter with his lens. "Here, Watson." "Ah, come and look." I crouched beside him. In the upper left corner of the blotter, barely perceptible unless the light caught it at a particular angle, was a faint discoloration in the leather. Not a stain precisely, but the kind of slight tackiness that suggests something adhesive has been applied and subsequently removed. A seal, perhaps, I said, or a label? Neither. The area is too irregular for a label and too large for a seal. I believe it is the residue left by a document that rested here under some pressure for an extended period, a document with a particularly absorbent backing paper that transferred a slight adhesive quality to the leather surface beneath it. He rose and moved to the far side of the desk, and here. On the floor beside the desk, partly obscured by the leg of the chair, lay a small scrap of paper that I had entirely failed to notice on our previous visit. It was perhaps 2 inches square, torn unevenly at its edges, and bore no writing on its upper surface. Holmes picked it up with extraordinary delicacy and carried it to the window, holding it at a low angle to the light. Indentations, he said quietly. The paper was beneath another sheet when someone wrote upon it. The pressure of the pen transferred an impression. He studied it for a long moment. The first line is too faint to recover. The second line is partially legible, and the third, he paused. The third is quite clear. He passed it to me. I held it to the light as he had done, tilting it slowly until the shallow grooves caught the pale winter sunshine and gave up their ghosts. The first line was indeed unrecoverable. A ghost of curves and angles that resolved into nothing. The second yielded perhaps half its content, something ending in the letters "Wait, declare." The third line was, as Holmes had said, clear enough. It read, "And submit this account to the proper authorities without further delay." I straightened and looked at Holmes. He was watching me with the still attention of a man who has already passed through the emotion a revelation provokes, and arrived at the analytical calm on the other side. "It is the declaration," I said, "a page of it, or rather, the impression left by a page of it, on the sheet beneath. Sir Lionel was writing it here, at this desk, in the days before his death." Holmes took the scrap from me and replaced it in his pocket with the envelope. The phrase "submit this account to the proper authorities" is not the language of a man adjusting an inheritance. It is the language of a man making a formal disclosure, a confession on another's behalf, delivered to a legal or official body. And the rest of the document, the original, is ash. Most of it, but not, I think, all. Holmes turned slowly, surveying the room with that comprehensive attention that seemed to take in not merely what was present, but the shape of what was absent. A man burning documents in haste, Watson, burns the first pages first. He feeds them into the fire in order, because order is the habit of a careful mind even under pressure, which means that the final pages, the pages containing the signature, the date, and the summary of particulars, may have survived, either incompletely burned or not burned at all. You think they were taken rather than destroyed. I think Mercer ran out of time. The manservant heard something fall, Sir Lionel we must assume, and Mercer would have had perhaps 2 minutes, perhaps less, before the house was roused. He burned what he could reach most quickly, the earlier pages lying uppermost. What remained he took with him, intending to destroy it elsewhere. Holmes moved to the door, pausing with his hand on the frame, which means it still exists, or did exist until very recently. This thought had a particular quality of urgency that the previous developments had not quite achieved. Until this moment, the evidence had been historical, the record of what had already been done, but a document in Mercer's possession was a present fact, and a present fact could be acted upon. "We should search his rooms," I said. "We should," Holmes agreed pleasantly, "and we shall, but not yet, and not directly." He glanced at the door to the adjoining office, Mercer's own small room, its door standing slightly ajar. A search conducted without Mercer's knowledge is worth infinitely more than one conducted with it. The moment he suspects a search is imminent, anything he has retained will disappear. He paused. "I'm expecting a communication from Brussels within the next 2 days. Once I have it, we shall move quickly. Until then, I ask you to possess your soul in patience." Patience, I reflected as we descended the stairs and made our farewells to Miss Braithwaite, was a virtue Holmes demanded of others with a generosity entirely unsupported by his own practice of it. Yet I had also learned that his timing, however frustrating to endure, was rarely wrong. On the doorstep he paused and looked along the square with the absent inward gaze that meant his mind was already elsewhere. "There is one further thing the blotter tells us," he said, as though resuming a conversation that had only been briefly interrupted. "The adhesive residue, the mark left by the document that rested there under pressure. It is not in the position one would expect if a man were writing freely at his desk." "What do you mean?" "It is in the position of a document being held flat by a weight, or by a hand. Not in the act of composition, Watson, in the act of study. Someone read that declaration very carefully, pressing it down as they did so." He descended the last step to the pavement. "Sir Lionel wrote it. But someone else read it here, at this desk, before it was burned." I followed him into the pale October afternoon, turning this final detail over in my mind. It was, I thought, the most unsettling thing he had told me yet, for it meant that somewhere within that quiet, respectable house, the declaration had been read and its destruction decided upon, coldly, deliberately, and by a mind that had already for some time been preparing for precisely this moment. Chapter 7. The Convenient Explanation. Holmes kept his word. The weekend passed in Baker Street with a surface appearance of leisure that I recognised, after so many years, as nothing of the kind. He read, he played, he conducted a series of small chemical experiments that had no apparent connection to the case. And on the Sunday afternoon he spent 2 hours in his room with the door closed, which generally meant that he was thinking in the concentrated, almost physical way that he found difficult to sustain in company. I occupied myself with my notes and my medical reading, and if I occasionally found my attention drifting toward Russell Square, I made no mention of it. Monday brought a change of a kind I'd not anticipated. The message arrived at 9:30, delivered by the hand of Vashcombe's own clerk and marked urgent. Holmes read it at the breakfast table, set it down without comment, poured himself a fresh cup of tea and read it a second time. Then he passed it across to me. Ashcombe wrote that a discovery had been made at the Braithwaite residence that morning. During a routine tidying of the study fireplace, the first thorough cleaning since Sir Lionel's death, the household having been reluctant to disturb the room, the manservant had found, lodged in the narrow gap between the fireback and the left inner wall of the grate, a folded document that the fire had failed to consume entirely. It had been extracted with care, and though its edges were charred and portions of the text destroyed, a substantial section remained legible. Ashcombe had been summoned immediately. He had read what remained of the document. It purported to be Sir Lionel's declaration, and its contents, Ashcombe wrote, were deeply troubling. The surviving text indicated that Sir Lionel had intended to alter the inheritance arrangements governing the Braithwaite estate, specifically to reduce significantly the bequest left to Miss Eleanor, on the grounds of what the document described as serious and persistent disagreements regarding the management of the family's financial affairs. The declaration, if genuine, amounted to a near disinheritance of the niece in favour of various charitable institutions. I set the letter down and looked at Holmes. "Well?" I said. "Well," Holmes agreed, in the tone of a man who has just seen a gambit he expected, played precisely as he expected it. "This is what he has been waiting to produce," I said. "A burned document, partially destroyed, partially legible, enough to be read, not enough to be questioned in every particular." "A burned document found in the fireplace," Holmes said, "which is precisely where one would expect to find a burned document. Lodged, more conveniently, in a position that protected it from total destruction, legible in the portions that matter most." He set his teacup down with the faint deliberateness of a man restraining a stronger impulse. "Mercier has been busy over the weekend. We went to Russell Square within the hour. Ashcombe met us in the entrance hall, his expression combining professional gravity with something that looked very like relief at our arrival. He led us directly to the study, where the document in question lay on the cleared desk, a sheet of slightly scorched paper that had been unfolded and smoothed flat. The household was assembled in the drawing room, Ashcombe explained, awaiting developments. Holmes asked that they remain there for the present, and the solicitor nodded and withdrew, pulling the study door close behind him. Holmes bent over the document without touching it, and remained there for some minutes in absolute stillness. I stood to one side and watched his face, which in these moments of examination became quite expressionless, the scholarly blankness of a mind so fully occupied with a single task that all other functions temporarily suspended themselves. Then he straightened, crossed to the window, and looked out at the plane trees in the square. "Read it, Watson," he said. "Tell me your general impression." I bent over the document and read it carefully. The handwriting was Sir Lionel's, or appeared to be, rendered in the firm, upright strokes I had come to know from the legitimate correspondence Holmes had shown me. The language was formal and deliberate, the syntax of a careful man accustomed to legal precision. It expressed, in measured but unmistakable terms, a decision to reduce Miss Eleanor's inheritance substantially, citing irreconcilable differences in financial philosophy and specific disagreements about the direction of the family's charitable commitments. "It reads convincingly," I said. "The language is consistent with a man of Sir Lionel's habits. The handwriting is a reasonable match to the legitimate samples." "A reasonable match," Holmes repeated, "not an exact one." "No," I said, looking again. "The capital E, there are 3 instances here, has that slight forward lean we identified in the forged correspondence, and the pressure on the downstrokes is absent." I straightened. "It is the same hand that produced the imitation letters, not Sir Lionel's at all." "Precisely so." Holmes turned from the window. "Now observe the paper." I looked. It was the same cream stock used throughout the Braithwaite household's correspondence, consistent with what I had seen before. "The charring," Holmes said. "Come here." I joined him at the desk, and he indicated, with a careful forefinger hovering just above the surface, the pattern of burning along the document's edges and lower portion. It was uneven, the char marks deeper on the right side than the left, and along the lower edge the damage was confined to a narrow band rather than spreading inward, as one would expect of a document that had lain in a fire. "A document placed in a burning grate," Holmes said quietly, "is exposed to heat from below and around it. The burning tends to be comprehensive unless the document is removed very quickly, or protected by position. This document has been burned selectively, held, I believe, over a flame rather than placed in one, so that specific portions could be destroyed while others were preserved. The charring pattern is entirely wrong for a document that fell or was thrown into a fire and lay there." "He burned it himself," I said, "manufactured the damage, and then wedged it into the gap beside the fireback, where it would appear to have been driven by the heat and preserved by its position." Holmes moved away from the desk. "It is well done. It would have satisfied most investigators. The document appears aged by fire. Its origin is explicable. Its contents are dramatic but not implausible. And its effect, if accepted, is to resolve the entire affair in a manner that damages Miss Eleanor. It disposes of the question of the missing declaration by providing a declaration, and closes every line of inquiry that might threaten Mercier's position." I thought of Ashcombe's letter. Deeply troubling, he had written, and it would have been to anyone who accepted the document at face value. "The household is in the drawing-room," I said. "They are, and among them is a man who spent some portion of his weekend manufacturing evidence, and who is now waiting to see whether it is believed." Holmes moved to the door. "I should like to see his face when we examine this document in company, Watson. Not to challenge him yet. The moment for that has not arrived. But a man who has invested so much patience in a scheme finds it very difficult, when the scheme appears to be succeeding, to maintain precisely the correct degree of relief. Too little suggests indifference. Too much suggests foreknowledge." We went to the drawing-room. The 4 members of the household were arranged about it with the self-conscious naturalness of people who have been sitting in silence and attempting to appear otherwise. Miss Eleanor sat nearest the window, her hands in her lap. Colonel Harrington stood by the mantelpiece with his habitual contained energy. Dr. Fenwick occupied an upright chair near the door, his professional composure intact. Mercer sat apart from the others in a small chair near the bookcase, and when Holmes entered and addressed the room with easy courtesy, it was Mercer's face I watched most carefully. He was very good. The expression he wore was precisely calibrated, a blend of sober concern and restrained anticipation that would have struck any casual observer as entirely appropriate to the occasion. But there was, beneath it, something that did not belong to the performance, a brightness in the eyes that was not distress, the almost imperceptible forward inclination of a man waiting not to hear news but to confirm it. Holmes spoke briefly about the discovered document, thanked the household for their patience, and said that certain technical examinations remained before any conclusions could be drawn. He made no accusation. He invited no response beyond a few clarifying questions about the fireplace's routine maintenance, which the manservant answered plainly from the doorway. Throughout all of this, Mercer said nothing. He sat with his hands folded and his expression composed, and only once, when Holmes mentioned in passing that the document would require further analysis before its authenticity could be confirmed, did that careful composure flicker. It was a small thing, gone almost before it registered, the briefest tightening around the eyes. Holmes saw it. I know he did, because as we descended the front steps to the pavement, he said, without preamble and without turning his head, "He's not quite as certain of himself as he wishes to appear, Watson. The waiting has cost him something." "What do we do now?" Holmes settled his coat collar against the October air. "Now," he said, "we give him one more day to wonder, and then we end it." Chapter 8. The detail no one noticed. There is a form of patience that is not passive. Well, Holmes practiced it on the Tuesday with all the outward appearance of a man who has set a troublesome matter aside, but I had lived beside him long enough to recognise the particular quality of his stillness, the way he moved through the rooms of Baker Street with the contained, purposeful quiet of a mechanism fully wound and awaiting only the release of its spring. He ate a reasonable breakfast, answered 2 letters unconnected with the Braithwaite affair, and spent the late morning in his chair with the forged declaration laid flat on the table before him, under a sheet of glass, the lens in his hand, examining it with the systematic thoroughness of a geologist reading strata. I sat with my notes and endeavoured not to interrupt. Shortly before noon he set down the lens and said, without preamble, "Come here." "Watson." I joined him at the table. He had weighted the corners of the document with small glass bottles to keep it perfectly flat, and the oblique light from the window fell across it, at the angle he had adjusted the table lamp to reinforce. He pointed to the lower right corner of the document where the signature read, in a hand identical to the body of the text, L. Braithwaite. "Tell me what you see," he said. I looked carefully. The signature was confident, the letters well formed, the ink consistent with the rest of the document. "It reads L. Braithwaite," I said. "The hand is the same as the body text, no obvious irregularity." "No," said Holmes. "So now look at these." He laid beside the document 3 of the legitimate letters from Sir Lionel's correspondence, letters whose authenticity had been established beyond question by their dates, their recipients, and the solicitor's personal familiarity with them. Each was signed at the foot. I bent over them and read the signatures in turn. Lionel Braithwaite, each one. The full given name, never abbreviated. Lionel Braithwaite, executed with the slight forward pressure and the open-topped E that characterised Sir Lionel's genuine hand throughout. I straightened and looked at Holmes. He always signed in full. Every legal document in Ashcombe's possession covering 30 years of Sir Lionel's affairs bears the same signature, Holmes said. Lionel Braithwaite, complete and unabbreviated. It was, Ashcombe tells me, a personal principle with him, a formal document signed with a formal name. He considered the use of initials on legal papers a mark of carelessness. Holmes tapped the glass above the forged signature with one deliberate finger. Mercier was meticulous enough to reproduce the handwriting, the paper, the language, and the general form. He was not meticulous enough to verify how Sir Lionel actually signed his name on documents of this class. The abbreviation L. Braithwaite is how a secretary refers to his employer in an index or a correspondence file. It is not how Sir Lionel Braithwaite signed a legal declaration in his own hand. The simplicity of it was, as Holmes's best observations invariably were, both obvious in retrospect and entirely invisible until pointed out. A single letter, or rather, the absence of several, standing as the signature's sole but decisive flaw. And the ink, I said, the connection arriving as I spoke. The signature. Holmes's expression acknowledged the inference. The signature ink, he said. I have tested separately from the body text. The body was written in the standard English iron gall ink, Sir Lionel's own, taken from the desk ink stand, which Mercier had legitimate access to as secretary. A careful touch. But the signature... He paused with the slight emphasis of a man who has saved a particular satisfaction for this moment, was added separately in the Belgian ink. The drying rate and tannic acid composition are unmistakable. I sat down. He wrote the body first using Sir Lionel's own ink. Then he added the signature from his own supply, almost certainly because he needed the signature to match the forged specimens he had already produced in Sir Lionel's name. The letters we examined on Friday. He had practiced the body of text extensively and felt secure in the imitation, but a signature is a different muscle memory from ordinary writing, and he apparently felt more confident forging it in the ink he habitually used. Holmes moved away from the table. It was an error of the kind that only a person absolutely certain of their method would make. He was too confident, Watson. He had succeeded for too long without discovery, and success had made him careless in small things. It is enough, I said. The abbreviated signature and the wrong ink together, that is enough. For my purposes, certainly. For a court of law, they are the beginning rather than the end, but they are a sufficiently firm foundation upon which to build. He crossed to the writing desk and drew a sheet of paper toward him. I am writing to Ashcombe now, requesting his presence at Russell Square tomorrow morning at 11. I am also, and here I must ask your indulgence for a small deception, writing to Mercier directly as Ashcombe's agent, informing him that the document has been examined and that its authenticity appears confirmed, and that a final meeting of the household has been arranged to settle the matter of the estate. I watched him write for a moment. You wish him to believe the forgery has succeeded? I wish him to arrive tomorrow in the full, comfortable conviction that he has won. A man in that condition is less guarded, less prepared, and, he dipped the pen, rather more likely to make the second error that follows inevitably from the first. And the genuine declaration, I asked. You said it was replaced rather than destroyed. You believe it still exists somewhere in the house? Holmes set down the pen and regarded me with the steady attention of a man deciding how much to disclose. I have a strong hypothesis regarding its location, he said, based on the adhesive residue, the pattern of disturbance I noted in the study on our first visit, and one detail that I observed during our conversation with Miss Braithwaite, which she provided quite inadvertently, and which she could not have known was significant. He permitted himself a brief, contained smile. I shall verify it tomorrow before the meeting. He would say nothing more on the matter, and I knew better than to press him. There was a quality to his reticence at such moments that was not obstruction but theatre. He preserved the final revelation for the moment when its effect would be most complete, not from vanity but from a conviction with which I had gradually come to agree that evidence presented in sequence carries considerably more force than evidence simply enumerated. That evening, as we sat on either side of the fire with the October dark pressing at the windows and Mrs. Hudson's tray between us, I found myself reflecting on the nature of the crime as Holmes had constructed it, or rather, as the evidence had constructed it, and Holmes had merely read. There was no violence in it, no passion, no moment of terrible decision made in heat. There was only method and patience and a cold arithmetic of a man calculating his own safety against another man's honour. "Holmes," I said, "do you think Mercier ever intended anything beyond concealment? When Sir Lionel died and the opportunity presented itself, do you believe he acted from a plan already formed or from improvisation?" Holmes was quiet for a moment, the firelight moving across his angular features. "From both," he said at last. "The broad scheme, the replacement, the misdirection toward family discord, the manufactured narrative of inheritance dispute that had been contemplated in advance. A man who spends months forging a dead man's signature has already begun to prepare for the possibility of discovery. But the precise moment, the specific form of the false declaration, the decision to implicate Miss Eleanor, those were improvised from the materials to hand." He turned to look at me. "Which is, in its way, more disturbing than either pure calculation or pure impulse. It indicates a mind that can plan strategically and adapt tactically, simultaneously under pressure." I considered this for a while. The fire settled. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the quiet. "Tomorrow," I said finally. "Tomorrow," Holmes confirmed, and he reached for the violin and said nothing further that I thought worth recording. I slept better than I expected, which perhaps speaks to some settled confidence I had developed, without quite noticing it, in the sufficiency of what Holmes had assembled. The small details had accumulated into something solid and interlocking, the way individual stones become, in time, a wall. And tomorrow that wall would be shown to the man who had spent weeks attempting to ensure it was never built. Chapter 9. The Constructed Identity. We arrived at Russell Square at 11:15, which was earlier than the appointed hour, and intentionally so. Holmes had said very little in the cab, and what he did say concerned nothing more remarkable than the weather and the comparative merits of 2 routes through Bloomsbury. I had learned to interpret this conversational lightness not as distraction, but as the final adjustment of a prepared mind, the brief, deliberate setting aside of the problem before the moment of resolution, in the way that a marksman will breathe out and still himself completely in the instant before he fires. Ashcombe was already in the entrance hall when we arrived. He had with him a younger man he introduced as his clerk, a Mr. Reeves, who carried a leather satchel and the careful, composed expression of someone who has been briefed thoroughly and instructed to observe without contributing. Holmes greeted them both and immediately asked to speak with Miss Braithwaite alone, before the household assembled. She came to us in the morning room, and Holmes wasted no ceremony. "Miss Braithwaite," he said, "you told me during our first conversation here that your uncle was particular about waste paper, that he burned drafts rather than leaving them in the study basket." She looked at him steadily. "I did, yes." "You also told me, when I asked about the inkstand, that you had replenished it yourself a fortnight before his death, that you had taken the bottle from the study cupboard where he kept his stationery supplies." "That is correct." "The cupboard on the left-hand wall, behind the smaller bookcase?" Something quickened in her expression, not alarm but the attentive recognition of a person who has not yet seen where a path leads but has begun to suspect its direction. "Yes, he kept paper, ink, sealing wax, the ordinary requirements." Holmes thanked her and asked her to join the others in the drawing-room, which she did with a composure that I thought admirable, given that she could not yet know whether what was about to occur would help or harm her. Holmes then asked Ashcombe to accompany us to the study, requested that Reeves remain in the hall, and closed the study door behind the 3 of us. The cupboard behind the smaller bookcase was a narrow thing, perhaps 18 inches deep, its shelves carrying exactly what Miss Braithwaite had described. Holmes drew back the bookcase. It moved more easily than its weight suggested, and I noted the slight wear on the floorboards that indicated it was moved with some regularity, and opened the cupboard. He examined the shelves briefly, then crouched and examined the cupboard's base with his lens, pressing 2 fingers against the lower edge of the back panel. There was a faint sound, a resistance, and then a yield, and a section of the back panel, not a shelf, not a drawer, but a narrow hidden recess of perhaps 3 inches depth, running the full width of the cupboard, came free in his hand. Behind it lay a sealed envelope. Holmes lifted it with care and stood. Then he examined the exterior without opening it, then handed it to Ashcombe. "The seal is Sir Lionel's," he said. "You will recognise it." Ashcombe looked at the wax impression with the attention of a man for whom such things are professionally significant. His expression underwent a change that began as surprise and resolved itself into something that looked very much like vindication. "It is his seal," he said quietly. "His private seal. He used it for documents of personal importance. I have not seen it in some years, but I know it perfectly well." He turned the envelope over. The handwriting on the exterior was Sir Lionel's genuine hand. "How did you know it was here?" "Miss Braithwaite mentioned that her uncle was particular about waste paper," Holmes said. "A man who burns his drafts is a man alive to the vulnerability of written material. He would not have left a document of this importance in a locked desk drawer, too accessible to anyone who obtained the key, or who might observe where the key was kept. He would have placed it somewhere whose existence was known only to himself. The hidden recess in this cupboard is not new construction. The wear on the latch mechanism suggests years of use. Sir Lionel had used it before, and Miss Braithwaite, who has lived in this house for 8 years and knows her uncle's study intimately, unconsciously directed me toward it when she described where the stationery was kept. The cupboard, the smaller bookcase." He looked at the envelope in Ashcombe's hands. "Mercier found the desk drawer empty when he opened it because the genuine document was never there. Sir Lionel had already moved it." Ashcombe received this in silence. Then he placed the envelope carefully in his leather case and straightened his coat, and his expression was that of a man prepared for what must come next. We assembled the household at 11 precisely. The drawing-room contained the same 4 figures as before, arranged with the same careful informality, but the atmosphere was altered, tighter, more expectant, as though the room itself had registered that this was not a continuation of the previous meeting, but its conclusion. Mercer sat in the same chair as before, near the bookcase, and his composure this morning was, if anything, more complete than previously. The letter Holmes had sent had done its work. He believed himself safe. Holmes stood before the fireplace. He did not pace, he did not perform. He spoke in the clear, measured tone that I associated with his most decisive moments, and he addressed the room as a whole rather than any individual within it. He began not with accusation, but with summary. The circumstances of Sir Lionel's death, the missing declaration, the discovery of the burned document in the grate. He outlined, briefly and without embellishment, the evidence he and I had examined. The 2 inks in the inkstand, the blotter's impressed text, the charring pattern inconsistent with an accidental fire, the abbreviated signature that no legal document of Sir Lionel's had ever borne. He spoke of the Brussels correspondence, the Ghent ink manufacturer, the Jermyn Street tailor's account in the name of Jules Mercier. Through all of this, the room was very still. Miss Eleanor's hands tightened almost imperceptibly in her lap. Colonel Harrington's jaw set. Fenwick fixed his gaze on the carpet with the careful inward focus of a man who has been expecting something of this kind and is now confirming that his expectation was correct. Mercer did not move at all. His expression remained composed, attentive, and entirely neutral. It was a remarkable performance, and I watched it with the particular attention of a man who already knows what is beneath it. Then Holmes said, "The document found in the fireplace is a forgery. Every person in this room has, I believe, understood for some time that the situation was not what it appeared. What no one in this room except its author has understood until now is why." He looked directly at Mercer for the first time. "Jules Mercier of Brussels," he said in the same unhurried tone, "employed 3 years ago by Sir Lionel Braithwaite under the name Julian Mercer, formerly financial clerk to the Anglo-Belgian Meridian Consortium, from whose accounts he removed, over a period of 18 months, sums that have been estimated by the Belgian ministry at several £1,000s. The silence that followed was of a quality that I have encountered only a small number of times in my life. Not the silence of shock, though there was shock in the room, Miss Eleanor's sharp intake of breath, Harrington's sudden stillness, but the silence of a moment in which something that has long been in motion finally stops. Mercer's composure lasted perhaps 4 seconds longer than any ordinary man's would have done. Then something went out of it, the way a light goes out, not a dramatic extinguishing, but a simple cessation, a removal of the animating principle. What remained was a face that was neither the smooth efficiency of the secretary, nor anything I could readily name, but simply a man caught at the end of a very long run. Sir Lionel, Holmes continued, recognised you eventually, whether from a communication received from Brussels or from his own recollection of financial irregularities that had troubled him years before, I cannot say with certainty. But he recognised you, prepared a declaration recording both the historical fraud and its continuation here in London, and sealed it. He told his solicitor of its existence, and then, before he could act upon it, he died. He paused. His death was natural. I want that clearly understood. The cardiac failure was genuine. The history was genuine, and Dr. Fenwick, who witnessed something that evening which he has been reluctant to disclose, but which I believe was simply Mercer's presence in the study rather than any act of violence, bears no greater culpability than a man who saw a shadow and said nothing. Fenwick looked up at this, and what crossed his face was unmistakably relief. What followed, Holmes said, was not murder, but opportunism of the coldest and most deliberate kind. The genuine declaration, which Sir Lionel had placed not in his desk but in a concealed recess within the study cupboard, was replaced with a forgery designed to divert every suspicion toward the family. The original— Ashcombe opened his case and held the sealed envelope briefly into the light. Has been recovered this morning, intact, bearing Sir Lionel's seal and his genuine signature. Mercer looked at the envelope with an expression from which all pretence had now entirely departed. It was a look I recognised from my medical practice. The look of a patient receiving a diagnosis they have long feared and can no longer decline to hear. Holmes turned to Ashcombe. I believe Inspector Lestrade is waiting in the hall. He was. He had been there since 10:30, patient and unannounced, a courtesy to Holmes that spoke of an understanding between the two men that required no formal acknowledgement. He came in quietly and did what needed to be done, and Mercer offered no resistance and said nothing worth recording. As Lestrade led him from the room, the 4 remaining occupants sat for a moment in a silence that was entirely different in character from the one that had preceded it. This was the silence of people who have been holding their breath for a considerable time, and have only now remembered that breathing is permitted. Colonel Harrington was the first to speak. He looked at Holmes and said simply, "Thank God." Holmes inclined his head, crossed to where he had left his hat and coat on the window seat, and began to put them on with the unhurried air of a man whose business in this room is complete. Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. The cab that carried us back to Baker Street moved through the midday streets at an unhurried pace, and Holmes sat beside me with his long legs extended and his chin slightly lowered. Sus, not in sleep, but in the particular attitude of a man allowing his mind to decompress after sustained effort, the way a mainspring gradually releases its tension once the mechanism has run its course. He had spoken briefly with Lestrade on the front steps of the Russell Square house before we departed. A quiet exchange from which I caught only a few words, Brussels and Consulate and Ministry of the Interior, and Lestrade had listened with the attentive respect he invariably brought to these concluding conversations, making a note in his pocket-book and nodding once with the air of a man confirming what he had half suspected, but lacked the means to demonstrate. We did not speak in the cab. The city moved past the windows, a costermonger's barrow, a crossing sweeper, and 2 ladies of quality regarding a shop window with the solemn deliberation of a judicial inquiry. And I watched it go by and thought about Sir Lionel Braithwaite sitting alone in his study on a Monday evening in October, writing by lamplight, pressing his seal into wax, placing an envelope in a recess that only he knew existed. the care of it. The precision of a man who understood that what he had written was dangerous, and that its safety depended not on locks, but on concealment. He had known, I thought, that he might not live to deliver it himself. Mrs. Hudson had set luncheon when we arrived, and Holmes ate with better appetite than he had shown for the better part of a fortnight, a reliable indicator, in my experience, that the mental energies which had been entirely committed to the case were now releasing themselves back into the ordinary business of being alive. We ate in comfortable silence, and it was only as Mrs. Hudson cleared the table and brought coffee that Holmes spoke at any length about the matter we had just concluded. "Fenwick will trouble you, I imagine," he said, without preamble. It was, as it happened, precisely what I had been turning over in my mind. "He saw Mercer in the study that evening," I said, "or heard him there, or saw him leaving it, and he said nothing. He said nothing because he could not be certain what he had seen, and because a physician who raises an alarm on uncertain grounds in the immediate aftermath of a patient's death invites scrutiny of the death itself." Holmes poured his coffee with the measured care he brought to small domestic actions when his mind was elsewhere. He was protecting himself, yes, but I think also in his way protecting Sir Lionel's reputation. A suggestion of irregular circumstances surrounding the death of a man with a cardiac history could have given rise to precisely the kind of post-mortem inquiry that Fenwick knew, as Sir Lionel's physician, would find nothing, but which would nevertheless attach itself to the name of a respected man long after the finding was forgotten. "He should have spoken," I said. "He should," Holmes agreed, without particular censure, "but he was afraid. And fear rarely produces the bravest decision. He will carry the weight of his silence longer than any court is likely to trouble him, and that is perhaps the most appropriate consequence." I drank my coffee and thought about this. The law's reach in such matters is necessarily limited to what can be demonstrated, and Fenwick's culpability resided entirely in a choice not to speak, a silence that had preserved Mercer's advantage without actively assisting his scheme. Whether professional censure would follow was a question for the medical authorities and not for me to adjudicate. "The Meridian Fund," I said. "Colonel Harrington approved expenditures that Mercer had falsified." "He did, in good faith, on the basis of paperwork that appeared legitimate. He bears no legal culpability, and I think his own conscience will deal more severely with him than any official inquiry would." Holmes set down his cup. "The charitable institutions that suffered under Mercier's management, both in Brussels and here, will require a full accounting. Ashcombe has already written to the appropriate trustees. There will be a period of considerable administrative difficulty, and the Braithwaite estate will likely contribute toward restitution in some form. Miss Eleanor, I suspect, will see to it." "She struck me as entirely capable of it," I said. "She is," Holmes said simply, "a woman of her uncle's temper, if not his generation's habits. She will manage the estate well." I was quiet for a moment, and then I said the thing I had been considering since we left Russell Square. "Holmes, the most remarkable aspect of this case, to my mind at least, is how nearly it succeeded. Had Ashcombe been a less observant man, or less willing to seek outside assistance, the forged document would have been accepted. Miss Eleanor's reputation would have been damaged, the inheritance disposed of in a manner designed to limit scrutiny of the estate's accounts, and Mercier would have walked away entirely clear." "Very nearly," Holmes agreed, "and would have done so, moreover, on the strength of a signature, a single abbreviated initial, where a full name should have appeared." He looked across at me with an expression that was not quite satisfaction, and not quite severity, but occupied the space between them. "That is the lesson this case offers, Watson, and it is not, I think, primarily a lesson about crime." I waited. "It is a lesson about assumption," he said. "Every person who examined that forged document, including Ashcombe himself initially, approached it in the full expectation that it was genuine, or at least plausible. That expectation determined what they looked for, and more importantly what they did not look for. A document found in a fireplace is expected to be damaged. A secretary's denial is expected to be disinterested. A physician's certificate is expected to reflect what he witnessed. These expectations are reasonable. They represent the ordinary functioning of a mind that has learned to allocate its attention efficiently. But they are also the precise vulnerabilities that a sufficiently patient deceiver will exploit. He turned to the window. The only defense against that form of deception is to ask not only whether what you see is consistent with the explanation offered, but whether it is consistent with any other explanation equally well. I wrote those words in my notes that evening, and I record them here because I believe they contain more of Holmes's essential method than any number of accounts I might give of his more dramatic demonstrations. The weeks that followed brought a sequence of formal consequences. The Belgian authorities, acting on the evidence assembled by Holmes and transmitted through Ashcombe's office, issued a warrant for Jules Mercier's extradition on the historical fraud charges. The English proceedings for the more recent offences were, in the event, conducted jointly with the Belgian matter, which simplified certain procedural questions and considerably accelerated the resolution of both. Mercier was tried, convicted, and sentenced to a term of imprisonment that the newspapers, when they reported it, described as exemplary. The genuine declaration, once unsealed and read in full by Ashcombe and the relevant trustees, proved to be precisely what Holmes had inferred: a formal account of Mercier's fraudulent activities across both countries, prepared in Sir Lionel's own hand and signed in full Lionel Braithwaite, in the firm and slightly pressured script that 30 years of legal correspondence had made habitual. There was, the documents revealed, a confessional quality to it that went beyond mere legal obligation. Sir Lionel had written of his own earlier failure to act decisively when the Brussels irregularities first came to his attention, a failure he attributed to misplaced personal loyalty and an unwillingness to damage an institution he had helped to build. The declaration was, in part, an act of self-reproach as much as accusation, the record of a conscientious man making amends for a mercy that had proved, in the end, costly to others. Miss Eleanor wrote to Holmes in November a brief, formal and genuinely warm letter in which she thanked him for the restoration of her uncle's intentions and expressed the hope that the charitable work Sir Lionel had valued would continue under competent stewardship. She had, she wrote, begun the process of engaging a qualified accountant to conduct a thorough review of the estate's affairs since Mercier's appointment. Holmes read the letter once and set it aside with the quiet approval he reserved for people who addressed practical difficulties with practical measures. Colonel Harrington called on Baker Street in person one afternoon toward the end of November, sat with us for an hour, and spoke about Sir Lionel with the honesty of a man for whom the truth about a friend is more valuable than a comfortable version of it. He blamed himself, he said, for not examining the Meridian Fund paperwork more carefully. Holmes told him that a man who trusts a colleague's documentation acts reasonably, and that the responsibility for the deception belongs entirely to the deceiver. Harrington accepted this with the quiet scepticism of a man who has formed his own view, and is too honest to entirely relinquish it. I found myself respecting him considerably. It was on the last afternoon of November, with the year drawing in and the Baker Street fire burning its best against a bitter evening, that Holmes made the remark I have placed at the conclusion of these notes rather than at the conclusion of these events, because it seems to me the more appropriate position for it. I had been writing at the desk and had set down my pen to rest my hand, and Holmes was in his chair with a book he was not reading, and the silence between us was of the comfortable variety that requires no filling. Then, without looking up from the unread page, he said, "A lie may be written with the finest pen in England, Watson, but the truth will still reveal the hand that held it." I asked him whether he was thinking of the Braithwaite case. "I am thinking," he said, "of all of them." And he turned a page he had not read, and the fire shifted in the grate, and the November dark settled over Baker Street with the patient, encompassing finality of a last full stop.